I'd say pretty inspiring examples of democratic pushback is here in the Republic of Korea. My biggest concern is that the President of the United States, for the first time in the history of the United States, doesn't believe in democracy. I've been complicit in creating the monstrosity that is now social media and its polarization.
안녕하십니까, 김선혁입니다. 저는 현재 고려대학교 행정학과의 교수로 재직하고 있습니다. 오늘 민주주의 연구의 세계적인 석학이신 레리 다이아몬드 교수님께서 오랜만에 한국을 찾아주셨습니다. 저와 교수님은 제가 스탠포드 대학 정치학과에서 박사 공부를 하던 시절부터 오랜 인연이 있는 사제지간입니다. 그래서 오늘은 좀 더 깊이 있고 또 진솔한 의견을 나눌 수 있는 기회가 될 수 있을 것 같습니다. Hi.
감사합니다.
Nice to see you again.
Great to be with you, Sanyuk.
Thank you very much for speaking with us today. Could you first update us with your recent activities or some projects that you are excited about?
The main recent activity in my life is resisting authoritarianism in the United States. Donald Trump has an authoritarian playbook. I think that was evident during his first administration. But there's now more of a theory behind it. There's more of a illiberal, if not authoritarian, network or alliance behind it. And he's moved from the very beginning of the administration, I think, much more vigorously and autocratically to try and challenge civil liberties, challenge the rule of law, erode the freedom of the press, the courts, and so on and so forth. And of course, intimidate everyone into silence or compliance. I'm also obviously continuing to try and look at the dynamics of democratic rollback, democratic backsliding, and the means that civil societies and political forces have used in countries around the world to resist this and reverse it.
So it looks like you are as active as you were in the old days when I was at Stanford. So, and I think you're in your recent columns and also other articles, you indicated that we are already well beyond democratic recession. We are at the stage of democratic crisis. What explains this aggravation?
We have a very large number of countries moving in an increasingly authoritarian or illiberal direction. And even very big democracies like India and to somewhat lesser extent the Philippines, Mexico, democratic erosion at least in Indonesia. And many of these countries are now to the point, big emerging market democracies, where you could argue they're not really democracies anymore. There isn't sufficient freedom and fairness in the electoral process and autonomy and protection for rights in civil society to really ensure a fully free, competitive electoral environment. So this is a very alarming situation. I think we are now at a global point in the arc of democracy where it is no longer the case that the majority of states, at least those over 1 million population, meet a minimal test of democracy. And that's a very big slippage from, say, the mid to late 1990s. The inflection point was really around 2006, 2007. That was the peak when democracy stopped expanding. And then it kind of leveled off. You know, almost as many countries or more were declining in freedom each year compared to the numbers that we're gaining. And we've now had 19 consecutive years, according to Freedom House, where more countries have been declining in freedom than gaining. And often the ratio is 1.5 or 2 times to 1. So you asked the question, why? First of all, this wasn't just happening in one region of the world. It's been remarkably global. You see slippage in Asia, you see slippage in Latin America, you see a rollback in sub-Saharan Africa, and then you begin to see illiberal forces and even autocratic forces gaining momentum in the advanced industrial democracies, beginning most clearly with the rollback in Hungary with the coming to power of Viktor Orban again in 2010. Ask yourself what happened in the second half of the first decade of the 20th century between 2006 and 2010 that was really happening globally everywhere. And certainly one of the things was the rise of social media and the extraordinary penetration of Facebook, YouTube, and other social media platforms to become a pervasive and, for many people, dominant form of communication. And we know from much social science research, and unfortunately many social scientists have been complicit in creating the monstrosity that is now social media and its polarization, that what fixates people's attention on a platform and induces them to spend ever-growing amounts of time on it is not so much amusement, a funny tape, of course that can be enchanting, an intelligent conversation, a thoughtful kind of parsing between different points of view. Instead, it's anger, it's outrage, it's conspiracy theories, it's disinformation. And that drives people down a rat hole of further suspicion, further disinformation, and a bipolar view of the world where you have friends and you have enemies. And that develops a desire for vengeance, retribution, and an existential sense that if the other people come to power, it will be a calamity. How can you maintain a democracy in that kind of information and normative environment? So anyway, I blame social media for a healthy dose of what's happening now. But that's only one element of it. If you look also at what's happened over the last 2 decades or so, you see a stunning trend in terms of the distribution of income and wealth in the world. And it has 2 forms. There's been significant redistribution of income in the world between countries. But within countries, within almost every country, except maybe the social democracies of Northern Europe, income and wealth distribution has become increasingly unequal. And also in the context of globalization, we've had significant deindustrialization, and combined with certain tax policies in the US and elsewhere, and the so-called race to the bottom, we've had more and more people actually declining in their absolute standard of living, more and more young people thinking that they'll never have as good a life as their parents. And this has certainly in the United States and Europe, but I think in a lot of other countries as well, created a lot of social, kind of political, psychological raw material for angry, disruptive, anti-institutionalist populism. And then that's the third factor. In response to this now, you have this model of illiberal populism that has been rising all over the world. And then the fourth factor is the rise of China as a major authoritarian disruptive power, Russia as well, the weakening of the West and the Western alliance, and a general kind of decline in normative commitments to democracy. And I think part of that owes to a decline in civic education. And we're kind of been riding on our laurels, taking things for granted, and just assuming that young people would somehow absorb by osmosis the story of democracy, of democratic struggle, of democratic sacrifice, and the dangers of authoritarian rule. It's very important to have reminders of the price of not having democracy.
So I think you added some more factors, including social media, and also economic inequality and other factors. But do you see any regions or countries that give you any hope? That, the example of democratic resilience?
Number one, I would say it stands embattled and more challenged than it has been at any time since the end of the Cold War. but it still has a reasonable amount of resilience and many kind of cases of hope and pushback. And I mean, we have to say it while we're sitting here in the Korean Museum of Democracy. One of the recent prominent examples, I'd say pretty inspiring examples of democratic pushback is here in the Republic of Korea. People rose up, they said, well, what we just said in protests all over the United States on June 14th, where millions of people came out onto the streets on the very day when President Trump was throwing a big military parade for himself in Washington, D.C. Somewhere between 6 and 8 million Americans across the United States came out on the streets and said what you all said in the streets here, and when you prevented President Yoon from declaring or succeeding in imposing martial law. In essence, no more kings. In Senegal, one of the more liberal politically and culturally countries in Africa, but one that has kind of frequently oscillated across the border between authoritarianism and democracy. For the third time in a generation plus, an elected leader tried to kind of impose himself, and he failed. And Macky Sall, and he was forced to leave, and he disqualified the mayor of Dakar, who was his principal challenger, and the opposition nominated somebody else, and they won, and there was democratic alternation. In Senegal, in Mauritius, this tiny island, one of the most liberal democracies in sub-Saharan Africa since independence, but sliding downward into corruption and autocracy. And the people mobilized again behind, a democratic political alternative, and they crushed the opposition, the ruling party, and they restored democracy in Mauritius. Botswana, another very small African country, but along with Mauritius, the African country that has been a democracy continually since independence, in this case in 1966. And the ruling party, increasingly corrupt, increasingly authoritarian, sliding down to probably below the minimum standards of democracy. And an election comes, and again, the ruling party is crushed. And a democratic coalition comes back to power and displaces a ruling party that had been in power for, nearly 6 decades. So, and we have a similar story in Sri Lanka recently, and you see others as well. It's not hopeless. We know what's needed to reverse democratic backsliding and the gradual drip, attack on democratic norms and institutions. We know that 2 of the indispensable conditions for democratic revival are, 1, an organized, vigilant, resourceful, united civil society, and number 2, a vigorous and effective political opposition that defeats this project in elections.
Right. Okay, now let's talk about the United States.
Okay.
And in a recent column in New York Times, Levitsky, Wei, and Ziblatt talked about competitive authoritarianism in describing the United States. Any comment on that, and how do you assess the status of democracy in the United States, and what are your biggest concerns?
My biggest concern is that the President of the United States, for the first time in the history of the United States, doesn't believe in democracy and is trying to create an authoritarian state. About that, I think there can be no doubt. He has to be prevented from doing so. My second biggest concern is that there's been so little political courage, so little evidence of principle, so little willingness to stand behind democracy against this authoritarian project among the members of Donald Trump's political party in the United States Senate and House of Representatives.
At the elite level.
Yes. So going along with that is our high level of political polarization. We will see that again this November when the Democrats recapture the governorship in Virginia, which I predict they'll do, win the governorship again in New Jersey. They've won some by-elections. And I think in 2026, it's pretty likely that the Democrats will reclaim the House of Representatives, and then we'll see what happens. Then we begin to head into the 2028 presidential race. However, that is clearly ambition of Donald Trump to create a competitive authoritarian regime along the lines, say, of Viktor Orban. And already Trump has done things that Orban didn't even dream of, like trying to punish independent law firms and take away, on a very grand scale, the funding for universities, use the prosecutorial authorities to persecute his opponents. It took years for Orban to move quite as viciously in that direction.
Do you think all these things are just a temporary setback in terms of the quality of American democracy, or will Trump's legacy be lasting and enduring in the future? I mean, if you make a prediction.
In the near term, it could do a lot of damage. First of all, it is doing tremendous damage to our competitiveness and our standing in the world. It's a gift to the People's Republic of China of almost unimaginable proportions in terms of their bid to displace the United States as the number one country in the world, the most powerful and technologically dynamic country of the world. I'm very confident it will fail in the medium to long run and that democracy will recover. In the short run, can this be stopped? And there I think that it is proper to have doubt and certainly necessary to have alarm. But I'm somewhat optimistic as well. Trump is meeting a tremendous amount of resistance in civil society, the courts, and other realms, and I think ultimately the electoral process. The early test will be what will happen if the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, the equivalent of your constitutional court, says clearly and flatly, this is unconstitutional, it is not permitted. I don't think Trump will openly defy such a Supreme Court order, but if he does, then we would have a constitutional crisis without precedent in American history.
I'd like to revisit this issue of the relationship between the presidency and the legislative branch of the government. In the case of South Korean recent martial law fiasco, I was very much intrigued by the relationship between the former president and the previously ruling party, and why the ruling party couldn't sever the relationship with the president and couldn't distance itself from the president. And I see some analogy in the US in terms of the Republican Party and Trump as well. Why do you think that is the case?
The one reason in common is that to a remarkable degree, each of our democracies are polarized bitterly, and it seems almost totally, between two main political alternatives, two political parties. To replace Mitch McConnell as the Senate Majority Leader in the United States, that many Republican senators lean in a more moderate direction. The reason why we know that is because the person who won that election, John Thune, was the slightly more institutionalist and less radical of the three alternatives, particularly the alternative that Trump preferred, a Florida senator named Rick Scott. He was the most Trumpist of the three. But that election was held by secret ballot. And when the balloting was done, Rick Scott finished last. When the ballot is held, as all other votes in the Senate are, by recorded vote, they're all paralyzed with fear that if they vote the wrong way, Trump will run someone against them in a Republican primary. We now have a verb for this. It's called to be primaried. And that means to be defeated for renomination in a low turnout primary election by someone who is more extremely partisan and ideological and less compromising than yourself. So a very important reason why so many more reasonably, moderately inclined Republicans have fallen in line to support Trump's outrageous cabinet nominees, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is ruining public health in the United States, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the head of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, the FBI director, Kash Patel. All of these people would have been defeated were it not for the fear of being primaried. But there's a third factor as well. In the House and in the Senate, there are a certain number of more centrist, reasonable, democracy-leaning Republican members of Congress who fear being assassinated if they go against Trump. And now, unfortunately, in recent days, we have an instance of a prominent member of the Minnesota State Legislature, the former Speaker of the House in Minnesota, who was assassinated by a right-wing Trumpist political crazy, and another person gravely injured who's a state senator. The levels of weapons and political violence in the United States are an extremely concerning dimension of this. I mean, you've had political violent attacks. They mainly happen with knives. When guns are involved, it's a lot more dangerous. And this is one of the things that most worries me about the United States right now, is the intersection between political polarization and the diffusion of large numbers of weapons, some of them weapons of war, automatic weapons.
All right, thank you.